Emmett Sloan stood in the barn doorway at dawn, watching his best friend eat what might be his last meal. The horse's name was Thunder, and he was a mountain of a creature, a massive Clydesdale standing a full 18 hands high, with a coat as black as a starless night. Even now, with the world crumbling around them, that coat gleamed under the first weak rays of morning light. But something was terribly wrong with this picture. A horse that magnificent shouldn't be destined for a glue factory, and a man with tears stinging his eyes shouldn't be preparing to betray the one living soul he trusted completely. Thunder lifted his enormous head, his intelligent eyes locking onto Emmett's. It was a look that went right through him, a look that said, "I know." But horses don't know about bankruptcy notices, do they? They don't understand foreclosure papers tacked to the front door, or the gnawing emptiness in a man's belly. They don't get that sometimes good men are forced to make choices that will haunt them for the rest of their days. Or maybe, just maybe, they understand more than we ever give them credit for. The strange part wasn't that Emmett was selling Thunder. The whole county knew the Sloan farm was failing, had been for years. The ground was tired, the well was running low, and the bank had finally run out of patience. Everyone knew Emmett could barely afford to feed himself, let alone a giant of a horse that ate more hay in a day than most horses ate in a week. No, the strange part was why he'd held on to him for so long. He'd turned down offer after offer, from farmers who wanted a strong workhorse, from breeders who saw the power in Thunder's lines. He'd starved himself some nights just to make sure Thunder's grain bucket was full. And the other strange part? The buyer. Sterling Maddox, the shrewdest, coldest horse trader in 3 counties. A man who could spot a flaw in a horse from 100 yards away and talk a seller down to his last penny. Maddox didn't do charity, he didn't do favors. So why was he willing to pay top dollar, more than any farmer had offered, for an animal he openly planned to sell for scrap? Men like Maddox didn't overpay unless they knew something. Something you didn't. Thunder pawed the hard-packed dirt of his stall. Once, twice. The sound echoed through the cavernous, mostly empty barn. It sounded like a drum beat, counting down the final moments. Emmett reached into his worn coat pocket, his fingers trembling as they closed around the folded papers he'd signed the night before. His signature, scrawled in shaky ink, was a death warrant. The sale was final. In 2 hours, Maddox would arrive with his transport wagon. 2 hours until his world became silent and empty. He took a step toward the stall, wanting one last moment, one last chance to bury his face in that coarse black mane and breathe in the familiar scent of horse and hay. But as he moved, his eyes caught something in the dirt just outside the main barn door, something that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. Fresh hoof prints. They weren't Thunder's. Emmett knew Thunder's prints like he knew the lines on his own hands. These were different, larger somehow, deeper, and they weren't alone. Someone had been here during the night, watching, waiting. The sale papers in Emmett's hand began to shake uncontrollably, because if someone else wanted Thunder, wanted him badly enough to sneak around his farm in the dead of night, maybe he wasn't just selling a horse. Maybe he was about to make the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. Emmett knelt, his old knees protesting as they met the damp earth. His weathered, calloused fingers traced the outline of the mysterious hoofprints. They were huge, even larger than Thunder's, and the sheer depth of them spoke of an animal of incredible weight and power. The spacing between them wasn't the wandering pattern of a grazing animal. This horse had been ridden here, with purpose, and it had stood for a long time. He followed the trail with his eyes. It led from a large oak tree at the edge of his property where the rider had clearly tied the animal. From there, another set of tracks appeared. Boot prints, human tracks. They led from the tree directly to the barn wall. Then they circled the entire structure, a slow, methodical patrol. Whoever it was, they hadn't just been passing through. They had studied his property. They had noted the layout, the entrances, the exits. They had peered through the gaps in the weathered old wood, taking inventory. From inside the stall, Thunder let out a low, rumbling snort. It wasn't a sound of greeting. It was the sound he made when a coyote got too close to the chicken coop, or when a storm was rolling in over the mountains. It was a warning. Emmett had owned the massive Clydesdale for 8 long years, ever since finding him as a half-starved yearling, wandering the high mountain roads, abandoned and alone. In all that time, the horse's instincts had never, not once, been wrong. He remembered the harsh winter of '91. For 3 days straight, Thunder had refused to cross the northern pasture, a field they'd crossed 1,000 times before. He'd bucked and fought and planted his feet until Emmett, frustrated but trusting, had finally gone to investigate on foot. He'd found a massive sinkhole, hidden by a thin crust of snow and ice, a trap that would have swallowed them both without a trace. Now that same instinct was screaming. Thunder was agitated, pawing the ground, tossing his enormous head from side to side. His dark, intelligent eyes weren't looking at Emmett anymore. They were fixed on the barn's rear entrance, the big double doors that led out to the pasture. The same direction the mysterious boot prints led. Emmett followed his gaze, and his stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. The back door. He always kept it barred from the inside with a heavy oak beam. But now it stood slightly ajar. A dark sliver of morning light cut through the gloom. He moved cautiously, his footsteps silent on the dirt floor. He reached the door and gave it a gentle push. The old iron hinges creaked in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The doors swung open, revealing the empty pasture beyond. And something was wrong, terribly wrong. His feed trough, a heavy wooden basin that took 2 men to move, had been repositioned. It wasn't stolen, just dragged about 10 feet from its usual spot, closer to the fence line. That was strange, but what he saw next sent a wave of cold fear washing over him. Scattered in and around the trough were fresh oats, piles of them, expensive, high-quality grain that Emmett couldn't afford on his best day. He certainly hadn't put it there. Someone had come onto his land, moved his equipment, and laid a trap. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that made him sick. They were preparing to lure Thunder out of the barn. But why go to all that trouble? Why not just wait for the sale in 2 hours? Why sneak around in the dark and set up this elaborate bait? Unless they weren't planning on paying. Unless they were planning on just taking him. The distant sound of wheels on the dirt road made Emmett's heart leap into his throat. He spun around, his mind racing. It was too early. It couldn't be Sterling Maddox, not for another hour and a half at least. He peered through the barn's wide front opening. It wasn't Maddox's heavy wagon. It was a smaller, lighter buggy, pulled by a familiar gray mare moving at a pace that was far too urgent for a casual morning visit. It was Clarabelle, his neighbor from the next farm over. Clara rarely visited this early. She kept to herself mostly. For her to be here now, driving her mare that hard, something was wrong. She pulled up short, her eyes wide as she took in Emmett's expression. "Emmett, you look like you've seen a ghost," she called out, her voice tight with concern. The attempted lightness in her tone vanished when she saw the look on his face. "Clara," he said, his own voice sounding hoarse and unfamiliar. "Did you see anyone last night? Anyone riding past your place? Someone on a horse? A horse bigger than Thunder?" Her face went pale. The friendly concern was replaced by a look of dawning horror. "Now that you mention it," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Yes, around midnight. I thought it was strange. They didn't use the road. They cut through the tree line. Behind my property. They were moving toward your place." She paused, her eyes darting nervously toward the woods that bordered Emmett's farm. "Emmett, what aren't you telling me about this sale?" Clara's words were like hammer blows, confirming his worst fears. He'd been so consumed by his own misery, so focused on the money and the loss, that he'd been completely blind. He had seen the sale to Maddox as the end of the story. But it wasn't. It was just the beginning. Someone else wanted Thunder, and they played by a very different set of rules. "There's more," Clara said, her voice trembling as she climbed down from her wagon. She was a tough woman, had run her farm alone since her husband passed, but now she looked genuinely scared. "The rider, he wasn't alone." She took a step closer, lowering her voice even more, as if the trees themselves were listening. "I saw at least 2 others, maybe 3. They stayed in the shadows, but I saw them. They had ropes and something else. A large canvas bag like a feed sack but bigger. Her eyes met his, and he saw his own terror reflected there. Emmett, she whispered, those weren't horse traders. Horse traders don't skulk through the woods at midnight with ropes and a canvas bag. The horrifying puzzle pieces slammed together in Emmett's mind. The expensive oats scattered by the trough. They weren't just bait, they were meant to drug him. A horse of Thunder's immense size would require a massive, carefully measured dose of sedative to bring him down. Someone had done their homework. The canvas bag wasn't for feed, it was for his head. A hood to blind him, to disorient him, to stifle his cries. The extra ropes. They planned to truss him up like an animal for slaughter and haul him away while he was unconscious. This wasn't a simple theft. It was a professional, well-planned abduction. "Who else knows you're selling him to Maddox?" Clara asked, her gaze sweeping the silent, watching tree line. "Nobody should," Emmett stammered, his mind racing. We agreed to keep it quiet until the deal was done." But his own words tasted like a lie. "Yesterday, at the general store, I had to ask old man Peterson for an extension on my credit for grain. He must have guessed I was desperate. He might have mentioned my troubles to someone. Peterson loves to gossip." From inside the barn, Thunder's whinny grew sharp and urgent. It was a sound of rising panic. Both Emmett and Clara turned as the massive horse began to kick at his stall door. A series of thunderous booms echoed through the barn. He had never in 8 years done anything like that before. His ears were pinned flat against his massive skull. His nostrils were flared wide, and he was staring, unblinking, toward the dense woods behind the property. "They're still out there," Clara whispered, a hand flying to her mouth. "He can sense them. They're watching us right now." In a single fluid motion, Emmett turned and snatched the heavy rifle from the wooden pegs just inside the barn door. His hands, which had been trembling moments before, were now steady. The cold, familiar weight of the weapon was a small comfort. He broke it open, checked the chamber. It was loaded. "Clara, I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice low and firm. "I need you to ride for town. Ride as fast as that mare can run. Find Sheriff Morrison. Tell him everything. Tell him I have horse thieves on my property, and I might need help before Maddox even gets here." "I'm not leaving you here alone," she protested, her eyes wide with fear for him. "Not with them in the woods." "Yes, you are," he said, and his voice carried a new hardness, a cold resolve that made her take a step back. "Because if something happens to me, Thunder needs someone who will fight for him, someone who will make sure he gets to safety. And there's something else, something you don't know about this horse." He looked from Clara's worried face to the magnificent animal in the barn, who was now throwing his full weight against the groaning wood of the stall. "There's a reason they want him this badly. He's worth more than just his size." Clara's eyes widened. "What do you mean? What is he?" Before Emmett could answer, a sound cut through the morning air, a low whistle, long and drawn out, echoing from the woods to the north. It was answered a moment later by a second, identical whistle from the opposite direction, to the south. They were communicating, coordinating, boxing him in. Thunder's agitation exploded into a full-blown frenzy. His massive hooves, as big as dinner plates, struck the stall door with enough force to send splinters flying. The thick oak plank began to crack under the relentless assault. "Go! Now!" Emmett urged, turning Clara by the shoulders and pushing her toward her wagon. "And when you find the sheriff, you tell him to bring at least 3 men. Tell him these aren't ordinary thieves." As Clara's wagon tore down the road, kicking up a cloud of dust, Emmett heard a new sound, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was the sound of multiple horses moving through the forest, pushing through the undergrowth. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. The time for stealth was over. The time for waiting had run out. 3 riders broke from the tree line, moving with a chilling, predatory confidence. The early morning sun glinted off the barrels of the rifles in their saddle scabbards. Their faces were partially hidden by bandanas, a clear sign they had no intention of being identified later. The lead rider sat atop a massive bay stallion, an animal almost as large as Thunder himself. It was a perfect match for the hoof prints Emmett had found earlier. His 2 companions flanked him on smaller, but powerful, sturdy mounts. They fanned out as they approached, a classic military formation designed to cut off all avenues of escape. They had done this before, many times. Emmett didn't retreat. He stood his ground, positioning himself directly between the approaching riders and the barn. He held his rifle ready, the stock pressed against his hip, but he didn't aim it. Not yet. Behind him, Thunder's frantic neighing was a constant, desperate alarm. The horse's distress was so acute that Emmett could hear him throwing his entire 2,000-pound frame against the weakened stall door again and again. The wooden barrier groaned, protesting under the unbelievable assault, but for now it held. "Morning," the lead rider called out, his voice calm, almost conversational, but with an undercurrent of iron. It carried a hint of an accent Emmett couldn't quite place. "Heard you might be having some trouble with that big horse of yours. An animal like that can be a real handful when he gets spooked." "Horse is fine," Emmett replied, his voice flat and cold. His eyes flickered from the leader to the other two riders. They had already split apart, executing a practiced maneuver. One was circling around toward the barn's rear entrance. The one Emmett knew was unsecured. The other was positioning himself to block the main road, cutting off any hope of escape. They were professionals. "And he's already sold," Emmett added, his grip tightening on his rifle. The lead rider let out a short, sharp chuckle. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. "See, that's where we might have a little disagreement. That particular horse, he belongs to someone else, has for a long, long time, and we've got the papers to prove it." Emmett's mind reeled. Papers? What papers? This was his horse. He'd found him, saved him, raised him. "Papers can be forged," Emmett said, his voice a low growl. "Thunder has been mine for 8 years. I've got the bill of sale from the county auction when nobody claimed him. It's legal." "A bill of sale for a stolen horse doesn't make the theft legal, old man," the rider shot back. He reached into his saddlebag and, with a theatrical flourish, produced a folded document. "This here is a warrant, a legal warrant for the recovery of stolen property, specifically one black Clydesdale stallion. Distinctive markings include a white star on the forehead and 3 white socks." The air rushed out of Emmett's lungs. It felt like a physical blow. Thunder had those exact markings, a perfect white star, like a diamond, right between his eyes, and 3 perfect white socks on his left foreleg and both hind legs. They were as much a part of him as his gentle nature and his incredible strength. But he couldn't be stolen. Emmett had found him wandering alone, emaciated and terrified. There were no brands, no identifying marks of any kind, except for the ones nature had given him. He'd spent months posting notices, checking with every sheriff's office in a 200-mile radius. Nobody had claimed him. He had accepted finally that Thunder was well and truly homeless, a miracle gift from the mountains. "Even if that paper is legitimate, and I highly doubt it is," Emmett said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "you'll need the sheriff to serve it properly. That's the law." "The sheriff's a busy man," the writer said, his tone hardening, the thin veneer of civility gone. "We're here to save him the trouble. Now you can make this easy on yourself and step aside, or we can do this the hard way. But either way, we are leaving with that horse." Behind Emmett, a sound like a cannon shot echoed through the yard, the sound of splintering wood. Thunder had finally broken through the stall door. The massive horse burst into the main area of the barn, his hooves striking the packed earth like sledgehammers. He was a terrifying vision of power and fury. But he didn't bolt. He didn't flee through the open rear entrance, as the thieves had clearly expected him to. Instead, he did something that stunned every man there. He thundered across the barn and positioned himself directly behind Emmett, his enormous presence a solid wall of muscle and unwavering determination. The lead rider's confident expression faltered for the first time. He stared at the man and the horse, standing together as one. "Well now," he said, a note of surprise in his voice, "that horse is more attached to you than we figured. Might complicate things." Emmett felt Thunder's warm breath on the back of his neck. He felt the trembling power in the massive body standing guard over him. And in that instant, he realized something that changed everything. The horse wasn't just hiding behind him. He wasn't just protecting his master out of simple loyalty. Thunder was positioning himself for a fight. The standoff stretched, the silence pulled as taut as a bowstring. Every man was calculating, weighing his odds. Emmett could hear Thunder's breathing behind him, deep and slow and measured. It wasn't the ragged breath of a panicked animal. It was the calm, controlled breathing of a warrior preparing for battle. The massive horse had survived freezing winters and mountain lions alone in the wild before Emmett had ever found him. Those years had taught him a harsh lesson. Sometimes violence is the only language a predator understands. "Last chance," the lead rider said, his patience finally snapping. He drew a heavy pistol from the holster on his hip, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. "Step away from the horse, old man, or we'll move you ourselves." The rider's eyes were cold, dead. He meant it. But before anyone could make a move, another sound shattered the tension. The thunder of approaching hooves coming hard and fast up the main road. All heads, human and horse, snapped toward the sound. A single rider, racing toward them on a powerful gray gelding, dust billowing behind him like smoke from a battlefield. It was Sterling Maddox. He was an hour early, and his face was a mask of grim, desperate urgency. "Hold on there," Maddox shouted, his voice cutting through the tense air as he reined in his mount, the horse skidding to a halt near the armed group. His sharp, calculating eyes swept over the scene in a single glance, taking in the three armed men, Emmett's defiant stance with the rifle, and the massive black horse standing guard behind him. "Seems I've arrived at an interesting time," Maddox said, his voice dangerously calm. The lead rider kept his pistol drawn, but he shifted his aim from Emmett to the sky. He clearly recognized Maddox. "This doesn't concern you, traitor. We're here on official business." "Official business?" Maddox's weathered face creased into a deeply skeptical frown. He swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted, moving with a surprising agility for a man his age. "Funny thing about that, I stopped by Sheriff Morrison's office on my way out of town this morning. Wanted to file the proper paperwork for my purchase of this fine animal." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "You know what he told me. He told me there have been no warrants issued for horse recovery in this county. Not yesterday, not last week, not all month." A wave of relief washed over Emmett, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. The papers were a bluff, a forgery, but the relief was short-lived. The lead rider's expression hardened into something truly dangerous. The failure of his bluff had only made him more resolved. "Paperwork gets delayed sometimes. We can't wait around for every backwoods bureaucrat to catch up." He gestured with his pistol to his companions, who had quietly, almost imperceptibly, moved their horses to completely surround the small group by the barn. The trap was sprung. "The horse comes with us," the rider said, his voice flat with finality. "Today." Maddox didn't flinch. He stood his ground, studying the situation with the cool, calculating gaze of a man who had survived decades of high-stakes deals and dangerous men. "Tell you what," he said, his voice like gravel. "I've got a bill of sale right here." He tapped his coat pocket. "Signed by Mr. Sloan, witnessed and notarized, legal as Sunday service. You want to challenge it? Take it up with the courts." "Courts take too long," the lead rider replied with a dismissive sneer. "And some properties are too valuable to be left in the wrong hands." That's when it hit Emmett. The way the man said properties, the expensive gear on their horses, the quality of their weapons, their calm, professional confidence, even when faced with a man with a rifle. These weren't just common horse thieves trying to steal a work animal. They spoke with the authority of men who were used to taking exactly what they wanted, without question and without consequence. They worked for someone with serious money, serious influence. Thunder sensed the shift, the escalation in tension. He took a deliberate step forward, planting himself squarely between Emmett and the armed riders. The horse's ears lay flat against his skull, a clear sign of aggression. His muscles were coiled like powerful springs, ready to unleash a devastating explosion of force. 8 years of partnership had taught him to read Emmett's every mood, every subtle shift in posture. And right now, his human was preparing for a fight to the death. The lead rider saw it too. He raised his pistol again, the barrel now pointing directly at Thunder's massive chest. "That's a real pretty horse," he said, his voice dripping with menace. It would be a damn shame if something happened to him, all because his owner couldn't see reason. The man's finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. Emmett braced himself, ready to fire his own rifle, even though he knew it would be a futile gesture. But then a new sound reached their ears. Louder than before, more urgent. The sound of multiple horses approaching at a full gallop. And with it, the faint, unmistakable jingle of official spurs and tack. A sound that could only mean one thing. The law was coming. Sheriff Morrison arrived with 3 deputies in tow, their horses lathered with sweat from the hard ride. Clarabelle's urgent message had clearly hit its mark. The lawman, a tall, weathered man with eyes that missed nothing, took in the entire scene in a heartbeat. The lead rider's confidence finally wavered as official, armed authority surrounded him and his men. But he didn't lower his weapon. Not yet. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Morrison called out, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. He swung down from his horse, his hand resting casually, almost lazily, on the grip of his holstered pistol. "Seems we have ourselves a bit of a disagreement about horse ownership. Why don't you let me see those fancy papers you're waving around?" The lead rider hesitated for a long moment, his eyes darting from the sheriff to his deputies, who were now strategically positioned, cutting off his own men. Finally, with a sigh of frustration, he slowly holstered his weapon and handed over the folded document. Morrison took it and unfolded it carefully. He read it, his expression growing more and more skeptical with each line. He held it up to the light, then rubbed the paper between his thumb and forefinger. "Well now, this here's interesting," the sheriff said finally, a grim smile touching his lips. "According to this warrant, you're looking for a horse stolen from the Blackwood Ranch, over in Colorado Territory." He looked up, his sharp eyes pinning the rider in place. "Problem is, the Blackwood Ranch burned to the ground 3 years ago. Old man Thomas Blackwood died in the fire. His entire estate was settled, and all remaining livestock was sold off at public auction." Behind Emmett, Thunder shifted his massive weight. The horse pressed closer, a warm, solid presence of reassurance. But Emmett felt a new tension in the animal. The mention of the Blackwood Ranch had triggered something, a deep, resonant memory that seemed to go far beyond simple fear. "Records get confused," the lead rider replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The lie was falling apart. "Maybe the horse escaped before the sale." "Maybe," Morrison agreed, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Or maybe someone is trying to steal a very valuable animal using forged papers and intimidation. Wouldn't be the first time we've seen that particular scheme around here." Sterling Maddox stepped forward then, pulling his own set of documents from his coat. "Sheriff, what I have here is a legitimate bill of sale. I purchased this horse fair and square from Mr. Emmett Sloan, who has owned him legally for the past 8 years. I've got witnesses to the transaction and everything." But even as Maddox spoke, defending his legal claim, Emmett noticed something troubling. The horse trader's eyes. They kept darting from Thunder to the mysterious riders and back again. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, recognition, fear. He looked like a man who had just walked into a room and recognized a ghost from his past. The man who had seemed like a savior just minutes ago now appeared to be hiding secrets of his own. Suddenly, Thunder threw his enormous head back and let out a piercing, powerful whinny that echoed across the property. It wasn't a sound of fear. It wasn't a cry of aggression. It was something else entirely. It sounded like a call, a question sent out into the world. And a moment later, an answer came. The lead rider's big bay stallion responded immediately, answering with a similar, powerful call. Then the other 2 mounts joined in, creating a strange, unearthly chorus that seemed to convey complex information, a conversation held in a language no human could understand. In that chilling moment, Emmett understood. These weren't random thieves who had simply heard a rumor about his financial troubles. This wasn't about a simple workhorse. These men knew Thunder. Specifically, they had been searching for him. And the reasons went far, far beyond his obvious value as a magnificent animal. "Sheriff," Emmett said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the sudden silence. "I think we need to have a longer conversation about this horse's history." And I think Mr. Maddox here knows a lot more than he's been telling me. Every eye in the yard, sheriff, deputies, and thieves, turned to the horse trader. Sterling Maddox's face had gone as pale as fresh snow. All attention focused on Sterling Maddox, and the confident, shrewd horse trader seemed to shrink before their eyes. The man who'd arrived like a cavalry charge now looked like a man cornered by ghosts, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Sheriff," Maddox began, his voice barely a whisper, strained and heavy with the weight of a long-held secret. There's there's something you all need to understand about this horse." He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Thunder. 8 years ago, when Emmett found him wandering in the mountains, he wasn't just any lost animal. He was the personal mount of Colonel James Blackwood. The name dropped into the tense silence like a stone into a deep well. Thomas Blackwood's son, the lead rider, who had been slumping in his saddle in defeat, suddenly straightened. A flicker of angry recognition flashed in his eyes. He knew that name. Colonel Blackwood, Maddox continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength as he told the story, was transporting something incredibly valuable for the Army when his convoy was attacked by raiders, not far from Devil's Canyon. The official report said everyone died. The colonel, his men, all of them. But they never found his horse, and they never ever found the cargo he was carrying. Thunder took a deliberate step forward. His massive hooves struck the ground with a soft, deliberate thud. His intelligent, knowing eyes were fixed on Maddox, as if he understood every single word being spoken, as if he were remembering. "What kind of cargo?" Sheriff Morrison demanded, his hand moving from his pistol to his chin in a thoughtful gesture. Maddox glanced nervously at the captured riders, then back at the sheriff. He licked his dry lips before answering. "Gold," he said, the word hanging heavy in the air. "A shipment of $20,000 in government gold coin. It was payment for a military contract, a payment that was never delivered because of the ambush. And then the Blackwood Ranch fire confused the records for years. The Army has been quietly hunting for that gold ever since." Emmett's mind reeled. $20,000. It was an unimaginable fortune, enough to solve every problem he had and every problem he could ever imagine. You're saying Thunder knows where the gold is hidden?" "Not exactly," the lead writer interrupted, speaking for the first time since the sheriff had arrived. His voice was bitter, laced with the fury of a man who had been cheated at the finish line. "But the colonel was a smart man, a clever man. Before the raiders overran them, he managed to hide the gold, and he left markers, a map, coded clues that only someone familiar with his methods would be able to recognize." He spat on the ground. "Trouble is, those markers, those clues, they weren't carved into a tree or drawn on a piece of paper." He looked from the horse to Emmett, a cruel smile twisting his lips beneath his bandana. "They were carved into his horse's saddle." The world tilted on its axis. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for 8 long years, slammed into place with sickening, breathtaking clarity. When Emmett had found Thunder, the half-starved, terrified yearling had been wearing a saddle, a heavy, elaborate military saddle, beautifully crafted but cracked and damaged from weather and hardship. Emmett, focused only on nursing the young horse back to health, had replaced it with a simple, practical work saddle. He'd never given the original another thought. He'd tossed the old saddle up into the dusty loft of his barn, where it had sat, forgotten, for 8 years. "The saddle," Emmett said slowly, his voice thick with disbelief. "It's still here. It's in the barn." As if on cue, Thunder suddenly wheeled around. He trotted directly to the barn entrance, stopped, and looked back at the stunned group of men. It was a clear, unmistakable invitation. "Follow me." The horse's behavior was so deliberate, so intelligent and purposeful, that it sent a fresh chill down Emmett's spine. "That's why you wanted to buy him," Emmett said, turning on Maddox, the accusation sharp in his voice. "It was never about the glue factory. You knew about the gold all along, didn't you?" Maddox nodded miserably, unable to meet his eyes. "I've been tracking the story for years, chasing down old Army rumors, half-remembered tales from prospectors. When I heard about a giant black horse matching Thunder's description, living on a failing farm in this county, I knew I had to investigate. I had to get that saddle. But the lead rider was already moving. Greed overcame his caution. 8 years is long enough to wait, he snarled, spurring his horse viciously toward the barn. We're taking the horse and whatever's in that saddle. Nobody moves! Sheriff Morrison's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. Deputy Williams, get between that rider and the building. This is an official crime scene now. But the rider was fast. He'd already reached the barn entrance, his horse dancing nervously on the edge of the shadows. But he could go no further. Thunder had positioned himself directly in the doorway. The massive Clydesdale had spread his legs wide, blocking the entire entrance with 18 hands of solid, unmovable muscle and bone-deep determination. His ears were pinned back flat against his skull, and a low, guttural rumble emerged from deep within his chest. It sounded less like a horse and more like a grizzly bear. The horse won't let me pass, the rider called back over his shoulder, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a wary frustration. He acts like he's guarding it, like he knows. Emmett felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought him to his knees, mixed with a cold dread for what was happening. Thunder had always been protective, but this was different. This went beyond loyalty. The horse seemed to understand, on a level no one could explain, that something precious, something that represented his lost master's last stand, lay hidden in the dusty loft above, something worth fighting and dying for. Thunder! Easy, boy, easy, Emmett said, approaching slowly, his hands held out, palms open and visible. The horse's dark eyes tracked his movement, but he didn't budge from his defensive stance. Nobody's going to hurt you, Emmett said softly, but we need to see what's up there. It was then that Sterling Maddox stepped forward. His face was pale, but his expression was no longer shifty or ashamed. It was filled with a deep, profound sadness and a new steely resolve. Emmett, he said, his voice quiet but clear, there's more. More you don't know. I didn't just track Thunder because of the gold. He took a shaky breath. I tracked him because Colonel James Blackwood was my brother. The admission hit the small crowd like a physical blow. Emmett stared at the horse trader, this man who had been a stranger, then a threat, then a savior, and now something else entirely. Your brother? My half-brother, Maddox clarified, his voice thick with emotion. Same mother, different fathers. We grew up together. When he died in that ambush, I swore on our mother's grave that I would find his horse, that I would recover what he died protecting. His voice broke slightly. That gold wasn't just Army payroll. A portion of it was his. It was meant to rebuild the Blackwood Ranch after the fire. It was meant to give our family a fresh start after we'd lost everything. As Maddox spoke, his voice filled with genuine grief and love, something incredible happened. Thunder's ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, swiveled forward, listening intently to Maddox's voice. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the massive horse took a small step to the side. He didn't abandon his post completely, but he created a narrow opening, just enough for one man to pass. The animal's behavior was so uncanny it was almost frightening. He seemed to recognize something in Maddox's tone, a familiar cadence, a shared bloodline, a quality that reminded him of the master he had lost so long ago. The lead rider saw the opening and seized the opportunity. That's my chance, he yelled, kicking his horse forward. But Sheriff Morrison was ready. Hold it right there, he commanded, his own pistol now drawn and aimed squarely at the rider's chest. This is still a legal matter, and nobody is searching anything without my authority. The Army has authority over its own property, the rider snarled, trying one last desperate bluff. That gold belongs to the United States government. And until I see papers that prove you officially represent the United States Army, instead of just claiming to, the sheriff retorted coldly, you're nothing but a thief, trespassing on private property with intent to commit armed robbery. Now get off the horse, slowly. But as the standoff at the front of the barn reached its peak, Emmett noticed something that made his blood run cold. While everyone's attention was focused on the lead rider, his other two companions had quietly dismounted. They were creeping along the side of the barn, moving like shadows toward the rear of the building. They planned to climb to the loft from the outside, while their leader kept everyone distracted at the front. It was a classic pincer movement, a smart, deadly plan, but they hadn't counted on the horse. Thunder noticed them too. The massive horse suddenly spun away from the doorway with a speed and agility that was breathtaking for an animal his size. He bolted from the entrance, not in flight, but with purpose, galloping around the barn's perimeter. Emmett heard panicked shouts from behind the building, then the sounds of men scrambling, cursing, and the terrifying thud of massive hooves striking wood. The sounds from behind the barn painted a clear and brutal picture. Thunder hadn't just chased the two would-be thieves. He had herded them. He had cornered them against the building's solid rear wall, his massive presence cutting off any chance of escape. He wasn't attacking them, but his threatening posture, head low, teeth bared, front hoof pawing the ground, kept them pinned in place, too terrified to move. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies moved quickly, circling around to find the two men trapped, their hands raised in surrender, their faces ashen with fear. At the same time, the sheriff disarmed the lead rider, who now found himself completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Seems your friends got themselves into a bit of a predicament," Morrison observed dryly, holstering his pistol. "Now, let's try this again. Let's see some real identification, and I mean official military papers, not some forged warrant you bought in a back alley." The captured rider's shoulders slumped in final, absolute defeat. "We're not army," he mumbled, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "We're private contractors, hired by a military surplus dealer out of Denver. He's been tracking rumors about lost government gold for 2 years. He's the one who made the papers." Emmett felt a complex mixture of relief and burning anger. These men weren't soldiers. They weren't government agents. They were nothing more than glorified thugs, hired muscle working for their own greedy ends. But the revelation about the gold, about Thunder's past, about the saddle sitting just a few feet above his head, all of that was real. The saddle still held its secrets, secrets that had the power to change everything. He turned to Sterling Maddox, who was staring at Thunder with an expression of absolute awe. "Sterling," Emmett said quietly, "if that really is your brother's saddle up there, then you have more right to it than anyone." Maddox nodded slowly, his eyes misty. He walked to the old wooden ladder that led up to the barn's loft. As he began to climb, Thunder watched him, the horse's intelligent eyes tracking every single movement, his head cocked to one side as if in curiosity. When Maddox reached the dusty, dimly lit storage area, he was silent for a long moment. Then his voice, filled with wonder, echoed down to them. "It's here," he called out. It's in perfect condition, wrapped in oilcloth." There was another pause, the sound of leather unfurling. "And, my God, there are definitely markings, carved deep into the leather. Coordinates, it looks like, and some kind of a map." 20 minutes later, the three thieves were secured with ropes and loaded, unceremoniously, into the back of the sheriff's wagon for the long, bumpy ride to the county jail. The forged papers were confiscated as evidence, and Sheriff Morrison promised a full investigation into the Denver operation that had hired them. But the real surprise, the final, stunning twist in a morning full of them, came when Sterling Maddox climbed back down from the loft. He carried the heavy military saddle in one hand. In the other, he held a small, heavy leather pouch that had been hidden underneath it. "Sample gold," he explained, hefting the pouch. It clinked with a soft, metallic sound. "James, my brother." He always carried proof of what he was transporting, just in case. He opened the pouch and tipped it. 3 heavy, shining gold coins fell into his palm. "This confirms it. The main cache is real." He looked up from the coins, his gaze meeting Emmett's. He looked at the poor, run-down farm, the empty fields, the man who had been willing to fight and die for his horse. "According to these coordinates," Maddox said, his voice steady now, "the gold is buried about 3 miles north of here, near the old abandoned mine shaft on the far side of Devil's Ridge." Emmett's heart hammered against his ribs. $20,000, a king's ransom. It would solve every financial problem he had ever had. And then some. It was a miracle. But Sterling Maddox's next words stopped him cold. "Emmett," he said, taking a step closer, "I've been watching you with that horse for the past hour. I saw how he protected you. how he trusts you, how you two work together, not like a master and an animal, but like partners, like family. Maddox's voice grew thick with emotion, his eyes shining with unshed tears. My brother. James would have wanted his horse to stay with someone who loves him like that, someone who understands him. Tears began to well up in Emmett's own eyes as he finally, truly understood what Maddox was saying. The gold, Maddox continued, his voice firm with decision. Legally, it belongs to both of us. My family has a claim to the original cargo, and you have a claim as the one who found and saved Thunder. We could spend years fighting over it in court. He shook his head. But I'm proposing a different arrangement. Sterling Maddox extended his hand. You keep Thunder. You give him the life he deserves right here. I'll take the coordinates from the saddle and go recover the gold. And when I do, half of everything I find goes to you. No questions asked. Enough to save this farm. Enough to make sure that horse never wants for anything for the rest of his long life. Emmett's vision blurred as tears streamed freely down his weathered cheeks. He looked at the magnificent horse standing beside him, then at the man offering him an impossible gift. After 8 years of struggle and partnership, after nearly losing Thunder to his own desperation, after discovering the horse's incredible secret history, he was going to get to keep his best friend, and he would finally have the means to care for him properly. He grasped Maddox's hand, his grip firm and sure. Thunder stepped forward and gently, so gently, nuzzled Emmett's shoulder, his warm breath a comforting presence. It was as if he understood, as if he knew that after a long and dangerous journey, their family was finally safe and would remain intact. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.